Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones people can see. In a world where appearances often define how we're treated, one woman carried both visible and invisible scars from a past that shaped her into someone extraordinary. She served coffee and meals to strangers who saw only what was on the surface, never knowing they were in the presence of a hero. But heroes have a way of recognizing each other, even across crowded diners and years of silence. This is the story of how one moment of recognition changed everything, not just for a waitress trying to rebuild her life, but for everyone who witnessed what true honor looks like when it meets courage face to face. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot of Mel's Diner as Sarah Washington tied her apron strings and checked her reflection in the employee bathroom mirror. The scar that ran from her left temple down to her jawline caught the fluorescent light, a permanent reminder of a night 3 years ago that changed everything. She had learned to angle her face just right when taking orders, keeping her left side slightly turned away from customers. It wasn't shame that made her do it, it was practicality. People tipped better when they weren't distracted by questions they were too polite to ask. At 28, Sarah had mastered the art of invisible service. She moved through the diner like a ghost in white sneakers, refilling coffee cups before they emptied, delivering plates with military precision, and clearing tables with an efficiency that impressed even Mel, the gruff owner who had hired her despite her lack of restaurant experience. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah had once been Staff Sergeant Sarah Washington, 1st Combat Engineer Battalion, United States Marine Corps. The diner buzzed with its usual morning crowd, construction workers grabbing quick breakfast sandwiches, elderly couples sharing morning coffee and newspapers, and business people checking their phones while picking at fruit cups. Sarah navigated between the tables with practiced ease, her movements economical and purposeful. Years of military training had taught her to observe everything while appearing to notice nothing. "Excuse me, miss," called a woman in her 50s, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the Formica table. "Could we get some service over here? We've been waiting forever." Sarah approached the table where 3 women sat, their designer purses hanging from chair backs, and their conversations peppered with names of exclusive boutiques and country clubs. The woman who had called her wore a cream-colored blazer and an expression of barely contained irritation. "Good morning, ladies. I apologize for the wait. What can I get started for you?" Sarah kept her voice warm and professional, automatically positioning herself so her right side faced them. The woman in the blazer looked up and immediately recoiled slightly. "Oh my goodness, what happened to your face?" she asked, her voice loud enough to carry to neighboring tables. Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest but maintained her composure. "An accident. Now, what would you like to drink this morning?" "Must have been some accident," one of the other women whispered, not quite quietly enough. "Poor thing. I bet she has trouble finding work looking like that." The third woman leaned forward conspiratorially. "I heard that girl with the scar is new. Mel probably hired her out of pity. I mean, who else would?" Sarah's grip tightened on her order pad, but her expression remained neutral. She had heard worse, much worse. These women had no idea what real hardship looked like. They had never watched friends die in desert sand or carried wounded soldiers to safety while buildings exploded around them. Their biggest worry was probably whether their nail appointment conflicted with their tennis lesson. "I'll give you a few more minutes to decide," Sarah said calmly, turning to leave. "Wait," the woman in the blazer called after her. "Make sure our food is prepared properly. I don't want any mistakes, if you know what I mean." The implication hung in the air like smoke. Sarah stopped, her back still to the table, and took a slow breath. In the Marines, she would have had colorful words for women like these. But this wasn't the Marines, and she needed this job. "Of course, ma'am. Everything will be prepared to your satisfaction." Sarah walked away, feeling the weight of their stares and whispered comments following her. At the coffee station, she allowed herself a moment to grip the counter and breathe. 3 years ago, she had been leading a convoy security mission in Afghanistan when the IED explosion changed everything. The blast had killed 2 of her Marines instantly and left her with injuries that ended her military career. The scar on her face was the most visible reminder, but the real damage was deeper, in her left knee that ached every morning. in the hearing that would never be quite right in her left ear, and in the dreams that sometimes still woke her at 3 a.m. "Sarah, you okay?" Mel's voice startled her from her thoughts. The 60-year-old owner stood behind the grill, his kind eyes creased with concern. Despite his gruff exterior, he had been nothing but supportive since hiring her 6 months ago. "I'm fine, Mel. Just need to get table 6 their coffee." "Those society ladies giving you trouble again?" Sarah shook her head. "Nothing I can't handle." Mel flipped a pancake with more force than necessary. "Rich folks think their money gives them permission to treat people like garbage. You're worth 10 of them, Sarah. Don't let them make you forget that." If only he knew how right he was, Sarah thought as she poured 3 cups of coffee. Staff Sergeant Washington had once been responsible for the lives of 20 Marines. She had led missions through hostile territory, made split-second decisions under fire, and earned 2 Purple Hearts and a Bronze Star with V for Valor. But that woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another life. She returned to table 6 with the coffee, setting the cups down with practiced precision despite the women's continued whispered observations about her appearance. "Have you decided what you'd like to order?" she asked. 3 egg white omelets, dry wheat toast, and fresh fruit," the blazer woman said without looking up from her phone. "And make sure the fruit is actually fresh. Last time we were here, the melon was practically rotten." "I'll make sure everything is perfect," Sarah replied, writing down the order. As she turned to leave, she heard one of them say, "I wonder if she was in some kind of gang fight. She looks like the type." Sarah's hand froze on her order pad. The type. She almost turned around to tell them exactly what type she was. The type who had served her country with honor. The type who had saved lives. The type who had earned the respect of some of the toughest men and women in the military. Instead, she walked to the kitchen and clipped their order to the wheel. The morning continued its predictable rhythm. Sarah served truckers who treated her with rough kindness, elderly customers who reminded her of her grandmother, and harried parents who barely looked up from corralling their children. Each interaction was a small performance, a carefully maintained facade of normalcy. During her break, she sat in her car in the parking lot and pulled out her phone. There was a text from her sister in Detroit asking when she might come visit, and another from the VA hospital reminding her about her upcoming appointment. She scrolled through her contacts until she found the number for Marcus Chun, her former squad leader who now worked as a police detective in California. They had maintained sporadic contact since their discharge, sharing the awkward small talk of people who had once trusted each other with their lives. She started to type a message, then deleted it. What would she say? That she was serving coffee to people who thought she was damaged goods? That she missed the clarity of military life, where your worth was measured by your actions, not your appearance? A sharp knock on her car window made her look up. Mel stood outside, gesturing for her to roll down the window. "Your break's not over, but I thought you should know. Those ladies from table 6 are asking for a different server. They said they're uncomfortable with." He gestured vaguely at his own face. Sarah felt the familiar burn of humiliation mixed with anger. "It's fine, Mel. Rita can take over their table." "It's not fine," Mel said firmly. "But it's their loss. Their money's as good as anyone else's, but their character sure isn't." As Sarah walked back into the diner, she noticed a new customer had arrived, a man in his 30s wearing jeans and a simple black t-shirt, sitting alone at the counter. Something about the way he held himself caught her attention. His posture was familiar, alert, but relaxed. The way someone sits when they're always ready for trouble but hoping not to find it. She approached him with a menu and coffee pot. "Good morning. Coffee, please," he said, looking up at her with steady brown eyes. For a moment, his gaze lingered on her scar, but there was no pity or disgust in his expression, only a kind of recognition that made her suddenly self-conscious in a different way. "Are you ready to order, or do you need a few minutes?" she asked, pouring his coffee. "Few minutes would be great. This your usual station?" "Most mornings, yeah. I'm Sarah." "David," he said, extending his hand. His grip was firm and brief, the handshake of someone who understood the importance of first impressions. As she moved to check on other customers, Sarah found herself glancing back at David. There was something about him that seemed out of place in the diner's usual morning crowd. His clothes were casual but clean and pressed. His posture spoke of discipline, and His eyes held the kind of alertness she recognized from her own mirror, the look of someone who had seen things that couldn't be unseen. The morning rush began to wind down as office workers headed to their jobs, and construction crews finished their coffee and headed to job sites. Sarah found herself looking forward to David's order, though she couldn't quite explain why. Maybe it was just nice to have a customer who looked at her without judgment or pity. When she returned to his spot at the counter, he had set down the menu and was watching the small television mounted above the coffee machine. The local news was running a story about a veterans support group that was organizing a charity run. Decided what you'd like? Sarah asked. The veterans special looks good. Pancakes, eggs over easy, and bacon. 3 days passed before David returned to the diner, and Sarah found herself watching the door more than she cared to admit. When he finally walked in on Thursday morning, she felt an unexpected flutter of relief. He chose the same spot at the counter, and she approached him with coffee pot already in hand. Good morning. The usual? She asked, surprised by how naturally the words came out. You remember, he said with a smile that reached his eyes. That's either very good customer service or I made an impression. Maybe both, Sarah replied, pouring his coffee. There was something about David that made her want to drop her professional guard, but years of conditioning kept her responses measured and polite. As she moved to put in his order, David spoke again. Sarah, right? Can I ask you something? She paused, order pad in hand. In her experience, questions from customers usually led to uncomfortable territory. Sure. That scar, is it from an IED? The question hit her like cold water. Sarah's hand involuntarily moved toward her face before she caught herself. No one had ever asked so directly, so clinically. Most people either stared without comment or made awkward small talk around the obvious question. What makes you think that? She asked carefully. The pattern. The way it heals. I've seen similar injuries before. David's voice was matter of fact, neither sympathetic nor curious, just stating an observation. Sarah studied his face, looking for the telltale signs of someone fishing for a story to satisfy morbid curiosity. Instead, she saw something that made her breath catch, understanding. Afghanistan. 3 years ago, she said quietly, the words feeling strange after so many months of deflection and half-truths. David nodded slowly. Convoy. Security escort. Route clearance went wrong. Sarah found herself answering details she had never shared with anyone at the diner. Details she rarely discussed, even with VA counselors. Marines. 1st Combat Engineer Battalion. Staff Sergeant Washington. She said her former rank with a pride she hadn't felt in a long time. David extended his hand again, but this time the gesture carried different weight. Gunnery Sergeant David Torres, 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion. Retired. Sarah shook his hand, feeling a connection she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Here was someone who understood the weight of those words, who knew what it meant to carry responsibility for other people's lives. Recon, she said with a slight smile. Should have figured. You've got that look. What look? Like you're constantly scanning for threats while trying to appear casual. It's a dead giveaway. David laughed, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise him as much as it did her. Occupational hazard. Hard to turn off, even when you're just trying to enjoy breakfast. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the morning rush, but something had shifted between them. As Sarah served other customers, she found herself glancing toward David with a sense of shared understanding that felt both foreign and familiar. The 3 women from earlier in the week had returned, taking their usual table near the window. Sarah approached them with the same professional demeanor, but this time she didn't automatically angle her face away. Good morning, ladies. What can I get you today? The woman in the cream blazer looked up with barely concealed disdain. Oh, it's you again. Well, I suppose we'll have to make do. 3 egg white omelets. And please make sure they're actually egg whites this time. Last week I could swear there were whole eggs mixed in. I'll make sure the cook understands, Sarah replied evenly. And for heaven's sake, try not to hover. We're trying to have a conversation, added one of the other women, waving dismissively. As Sarah walked away, she heard them launch into their familiar routine of whispered comments about her appearance. Today, however, the words seemed to bounce off rather than penetrate. Maybe it was knowing that David was sitting 10 feet away, someone who understood that scars could be badges of honor rather than sources of shame. Busy morning. David observed when she passed his spot at the counter. Always is around this time. Corporate breakfast meetings and ladies' auxiliary planning sessions. Those particular ladies seemed charming, he said dryly, nodding toward the table where the three women were engaged in animated discussion about someone's daughter's wedding plans. They're regulars. They keep things interesting. Is that what we're calling it? David's tone was light, but Sarah caught the edge of something sharper underneath. She refilled his coffee and leaned slightly against the counter. In my experience, people who've never had their comfort zone challenged tend to react badly when they're confronted with evidence that the world can be a dangerous place. Your scar threatens their worldview? Something like that. They live in a bubble where the worst thing that happens is the country club running out of their favorite champagne. Seeing someone who's obviously been through trauma reminds them that bad things happen to good people. And that's an uncomfortable thought. David nodded thoughtfully. You're probably giving them too much credit for deep thinking. Maybe. Or maybe I've just gotten good at reading people during my time here. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the kitchen. Mel's voice carried over the usual clatter of pans and sizzling grills, raised in frustration about a supplier's late delivery. Sarah excused herself to help sort out the morning's crisis, but she felt David's eyes following her as she moved through the diner. An hour later, as the breakfast rush began to subside, Sarah found herself with a rare moment to breathe. David had finished his meal but lingered over his coffee, reading something on his phone that seemed to require serious concentration. Work calls? Sarah asked as she wiped down the section of counter next to him. Sort of. I'm looking into a job opportunity. Private security consulting. Sounds like it would use your skill set. That's the idea. After I got out, I tried the corporate route for a while. Turns out sitting in meetings all day isn't really my speed. Sarah understood completely. The transition from military to civilian life was like learning to speak a foreign language where every conversation felt like a translation exercise. What made you leave the Marines? She asked, then immediately regretted the question. It was too personal, too direct for the careful boundaries they had established. David was quiet for a moment, and Sarah was about to apologize for overstepping when he answered. Medical retirement. Took some shrapnel in my back during my third deployment. Nothing that would stop me from doing the job, but enough to make the Corps nervous about liability. His voice carried the familiar bitterness of someone whose career had been ended by bureaucracy rather than choice. I'm sorry. Not your fault. Besides, it led me here, didn't it? There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah look up from her cleaning. David was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Here meaning the diner with the overpriced coffee and questionable pancakes. Here meaning meeting someone who understands what it's like to rebuild your life after everything you planned for gets taken away. The honesty of his statement caught Sarah off guard. In 6 months of careful conversations with customers, no one had come close to acknowledging the reality of her situation, let alone expressing understanding of it. Before she could respond, the bell above the door chimed, and a group of construction workers entered, their work boots loud on the worn linoleum. Sarah straightened, automatically shifting back into her professional mode. I should get back to work, she said. Of course. But Sarah? David waited until she looked at him. Would you like to have coffee sometime? Away from here, I mean. Somewhere we could talk without interruptions. The invitation surprised her. She had been asked out by customers before, usually in ways that made her skin crawl. But David's question felt different, less about attraction and more about connection. I don't know, she said honestly. I don't really date customers. Or anyone, for that matter. It doesn't have to be a date. Just coffee between two Marines who are figuring out what comes next. Sarah found herself considering the offer more seriously than she had any social invitation in years. There was something appealing about the idea of talking to someone who wouldn't need explanations for half her references or wonder why she sometimes flinched at loud noises. There's a coffee shop on 5th Street. Brewster's. They're open until 9. I know the place. Tomorrow evening? Around 7. Sarah nodded before she could change her mind. 7 works. David left his usual generous tip and stood to go. See you tomorrow, Staff Sergeant. It's just Sarah now, she called after him. No, he said seriously, pausing at the door. It's never just Sarah. Once a Marine, always a Marine. After he left, Sarah found herself smiling as she cleaned his coffee cup. For the first time since her discharge, someone had seen her the way she wanted to be seen, not as damaged goods or an object of pity, but as someone who had served with honor and was worthy of respect. The rest of her shift passed in a strange mixture of anticipation and nervousness. She caught herself thinking about what she would wear to meet David, then wondering if she was making a mistake. Romantic relationships had been complicated enough before her injury. Now, with the visible reminder of trauma written across her face, the idea of dating felt overwhelming. But this wasn't really a date, she reminded herself. It was coffee with someone who understood the unique challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life. Someone who saw her as more than her scars. As she prepared to leave for the day, Mel approached her at the time clock. "You seem different today," he observed. "Lighter somehow." Sarah considered how to respond. "I had an interesting conversation with a customer." Sarah changed clothes 3 times before settling on dark jeans and a simple blue sweater that complemented her eyes. She arrived at Brewster's coffee shop 15 minutes early, choosing a corner table where she could see the entrance while keeping her scarred side away from the main flow of customers. Old habits from both her military training and civilian service industry experience died hard. Brewster's was exactly the kind of place she had avoided since moving to town. Too intimate, too conducive to the kind of personal conversations she had spent months avoiding. The exposed brick walls were lined with local artwork, and the scent of fresh ground coffee beans mixed with the quiet sounds of acoustic music and murmured conversations. David arrived precisely at 7, scanning the room with the systematic thoroughness of someone who never entered a space without assessing exits and potential threats. When his eyes found hers, his face relaxed into a smile that made her suddenly glad she had said yes. "You're early," he observed, sliding into the chair across from her. Punctuality was drilled into me pretty thoroughly. 15 minutes early is on time is late, and late is unacceptable. Gunnery Sergeant Martinez used to say that exact phrase every morning at 0500, David said with a laugh. Some things are universal. They ordered their coffee from a teenager with purple hair and multiple piercings who seemed entirely unimpressed by their military bearing. Sarah found herself relaxing as they settled into the comfortable rhythm of shared experiences and common references. "So what's your story?" David asked once they had their drinks. "How does a staff sergeant end up slinging hash in a diner?" Sarah wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, using the warmth to ground herself. She had rehearsed various versions of this conversation during the drive over, but, sitting across from David, all her prepared responses seemed insufficient. "The short version is that an IED changed my career plans pretty dramatically. The longer version is more complicated. I've got time for the longer version, if you're willing to share it." Something in his tone, patient, non-judgmental, genuinely interested, made Sarah decide to tell him the truth. "All of it. I was leading a convoy security mission outside Kandahar. Intelligence said the route was clear, but intelligence was wrong. The blast killed Lance Corporal Martinez. He was 19 and kept a picture of his girlfriend in his helmet. It killed Corporal Johnson too, 22 years old, 3 weeks from the end of his deployment." Sarah paused, surprised by how easily the names came out. She had barely been able to say them aloud to her VA counselor. "I was lucky, if you can call it that. Shrapnel tore up the left side of my face and damaged my knee, but I was conscious. I managed to get 2 other wounded Marines to the extraction point before I collapsed from blood loss." David listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. There was no pity in his expression, just the focused attention of someone who understood the weight of what she was telling him. The physical recovery took 8 months. The bureaucracy took longer. Medical review boards, fitness for duty evaluations, pension calculations. Turns out that even if you can still do the job, the Marine Corps gets nervous about liability when you have documented traumatic brain injury and permanent hearing loss. "What was your MOS?" David asked. 1371, combat engineer. I loved it, the problem solving, the responsibility, the way everything we did mattered. When they told me I was being medically retired, it felt like they were taking away my identity." Sarah took a sip of her coffee, surprised by how cathartic it felt to talk about her experience with someone who understood the language and culture of military life. "The transition was harder than I expected. I had a degree in engineering from before I enlisted, but 3 years out of the field is a lifetime in technology. Plus, job interviews were brutal. Potential employers would see my scar and either treat me like a victim or worry that I was unstable. So you ended up at Mel's. So I ended up at Mel's. It was supposed to be temporary, just until I figured out what came next. That was 6 months ago. David was quiet for a moment, processing her story. What do you want to come next? The question caught Sarah off guard. No one had asked her about her goals in months. Everyone, family, friends, VA counselors, seemed focused on helping her accept limitations rather than exploring possibilities. I don't know anymore. I used to have 5-year plans, career goals, promotion timelines. Now I'm just trying to make it through each shift without letting customers' comments get under my skin. Those women from the diner, they don't represent everyone, you know? Most people respect service members, even if they don't always know how to show it. Sarah smiled ruefully. You'd be surprised. The visible scar makes some people uncomfortable, but it's the invisible stuff that's harder to deal with. Loud noises still make me flinch. I sleep better with a weapon within reach, even though I live in one of the safest neighborhoods in town. I have trouble trusting civilian authority figures because their decisions don't carry life or death consequences. All of that sounds pretty normal for someone who's been through combat trauma. Normal for us, maybe. But civilian employers aren't exactly lining up to hire someone who might hit the deck during a fire drill. David laughed, but not mockingly. You've actually done that? First week at a retail job, I tried before the diner. Store alarm malfunctioned, and I ended up on the floor behind a clothing rack. Management decided I wasn't a good fit for customer service. Their loss. Although I have to ask, weapon within reach when you sleep. Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. It was one thing to admit to hypervigilance and startle responses, another to confess to behavior that might sound paranoid to someone who didn't understand. Baseball bat, she said quietly. Nothing dramatic. It just helps me sleep better knowing I could defend myself if necessary. I've got a .45 in my nightstand and a shotgun in the bedroom closet, David said matter-of-factly. Living alone, old habits die hard. The relief Sarah felt at his casual admission surprised her. She had spent so much energy trying to appear normal, trying to hide the ways combat had changed her, that she had forgotten how good it felt to talk to someone who didn't need explanations. So what about you? She asked, ready to turn the conversation away from herself. How did Gunnery Sergeant Torres end up having coffee with troubled waitresses? Troubled waitress? I must have missed that part. I thought I was having coffee with a decorated Marine who's transitioning to civilian life. The distinction mattered more than Sarah had expected. Decorated. Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device, Combat Action Ribbon. I may have looked up your service record. Sarah stared at him. You what? Professional curiosity. Plus, something about your bearings suggested more than your average Marine. I was right. You were recommended for the Silver Star before it was downgraded to the Bronze. How do you possibly know that? David's expression became slightly sheepish. I still have contacts in personnel. And, before you ask, yes, it's probably a violation of privacy regulations. But, in my defense, I was impressed by what I learned. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions. Violation at having her privacy invaded, pride at having her service recognized, and confusion about David's motivations. Why would you do that? Because someone who carries herself the way you do, who maintains military bearing while dealing with difficult customers, who shows that kind of grace under pressure, that person has a story worth knowing. Grace under pressure? You mean when those women were being awful about my scar? I mean the way you handled their comments without losing your professionalism or your dignity. That takes strength, Sarah. The kind of strength that gets people through combat and out the other side. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of mutual understanding settling between them. Around them, the coffee shop continued its evening rhythm, students studying, couples on dates, friends catching up over lattes. You said you're looking at private security consulting, Sarah said, steering the conversation towards safer territory. What kind of work? Corporate protection, mostly. Executive security for companies doing business in unstable regions. The pay is excellent, and it uses skills that don't translate well to civilian jobs. Sounds dangerous. Less dangerous than what we used to do, and with better equipment and support. Plus, The clients actually appreciate the expertise instead of just tolerating it. Sarah could see the appeal. The idea of work that valued rather than dismissed military experience was seductive. Are you planning to relocate? Probably. The major contracts are based out of Virginia and California. But I'm in no hurry to make a decision. Something in the way he said it made Sarah wonder if his timeline had anything to do with her, but she pushed the thought away. They barely knew each other, and she wasn't ready to consider the complications that kind of connection might bring. What about you? David asked. Any thoughts about getting back into engineering? I've considered it. There are some veteran preference programs that might help with the job search. But, honestly, I'm not sure I'm ready to handle the pressure of a career where mistakes have serious consequences. You mean more serious consequences than serving coffee to people who judge you based on your appearance? The question was gently pointed, and Sarah found herself really considering it for the first time. Was hiding in the diner really safer than pursuing work that matched her skills and training? I hadn't thought about it that way. Maybe it's time to start thinking about it that way. You're not damaged goods, Sarah. You're a highly trained professional with leadership experience and technical skills. The right employer would be lucky to have you. Their conversation was interrupted by David's phone buzzing with an urgent text message. He glanced at it and frowned. Problem? Sarah asked. Work-related. Well, potential work-related. The consulting firm I'm considering just had a situation develop that might need immediate attention. Go, Sarah said immediately. I understand. David hesitated. I don't want to cut this short. This is the best conversation I've had in months. Friday morning at Mel's Diner started like any other, with Sarah arriving 20 minutes early to help prep for the breakfast rush. She found herself watching the door, wondering if David would keep his usual schedule or if the urgent call from the night before had disrupted his routine. When he walked in at his normal time, she felt a flutter of relief that surprised her with its intensity. Good morning, she said, approaching his spot at the counter with coffee already in hand. Everything worked out okay last night. Better than expected, actually. Turned out to be exactly the kind of situation that made me look good to potential employers. David accepted the coffee with a smile that seemed more relaxed than usual. Thanks for understanding about the early exit. Part of the job, right? Being available when things go sideways. Something like that. You seem to understand the demands of irregular schedules better than most civilians. As Sarah poured his coffee, she noticed that David's attention kept drifting to the local news playing on the small television mounted above the coffee machine. The morning anchor was discussing a break-in at a high-end jewelry store that had been thwarted by private security. That wouldn't happen to be your handiwork, would it? Sarah asked, following his gaze. David's slight smile was answer enough. Let's just say I was in the right place at the right time. With the right skills, Sarah added. With the right training, he corrected. Same training you have, by the way. Before Sarah could respond, the familiar morning rush began filling the diner. She moved between tables with practiced efficiency, but found herself stealing glances at David whenever possible. There was something different about him today, a confidence that hadn't been there before, as if the previous night's success had reminded him of his own capabilities. The three women who had become Sarah's least favorite regular customers arrived just after 8, taking their usual table by the window. Today they were dressed for what appeared to be a charity function, their conversation revolving around auction items and guest lists. Excuse me, miss, the woman in the cream blazer called out as Sarah passed their table. We're in rather a hurry this morning. Could we get some actual service? Sarah approached their table with her usual professional demeanor. Good morning, ladies. What can I get you today? 3 egg white omelets, dry toast, and fresh fruit. And coffee, obviously. Make sure it's actually hot this time. As Sarah wrote down their order, she overheard their conversation shift to the previous night's attempted robbery. Can you believe someone tried to rob Cartier's? One of them said in hushed, excited tones. Right here in our safe little town. I heard the security guard was some kind of military hero, added another. Apparently, he disabled the burglar with his bare hands. The woman in the blazer sniffed dismissively. Military types always think they're heroes. Probably just some failed soldier trying to feel important again. Sarah's grip tightened on her order pad, but she maintained her composure and walked to the kitchen to submit their order. Behind her, she could hear their conversation continuing. Speaking of failed soldiers, Have you noticed that scarred waitress always seems to be listening to our conversations? It's quite rude. Someone should tell management about her attitude. I don't appreciate being served by someone who looks like they belong in a charity case documentary. Sarah clipped their order to the wheel and took a deep breath, using the techniques her VA counselor had taught her for managing anger and frustration. She had dealt with worse comments, she reminded herself. These women's ignorance said more about them than it did about her. When she returned to the dining area, she found David watching her with a concerned expression. "You okay?" he asked quietly as she refilled his coffee. "Just the usual morning entertainment," Sarah replied, nodding toward the women's table. David's jaw tightened as he glanced in their direction. "Want me to have a word with them?" "Absolutely not. But thanks for the offer." "You sure?" "Because I'm having a hard time minding my own business over here." Sarah appreciated his protective instinct, but she had been fighting her own battles for too long to need rescue now. "I can handle them. I've had plenty of practice." The morning continued its predictable rhythm until just after 9, when the diner's atmosphere shifted dramatically with the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Colonel James Morrison, United States Marine Corps, walked through the door in full dress blues, his bearing unmistakably military despite his civilian surroundings. Sarah recognized his rank immediately, muscle memory from countless inspections and ceremonies making her want to snap to attention. Instead, she maintained her professional server demeanor while her mind raced through possible explanations for his presence. The colonel approached the hostess station where Mel was seating customers. "I'm looking for Sarah Washington. I was told she works here." Mel's eyes widened slightly as he took in the colonel's uniform and bearing. "She's working this morning. Can I ask what this is about?" "Official Marine Corps business. Nothing to be concerned about." Sarah felt every eye in the diner turn toward her as Mel pointed in her direction. Her first instinct was panic. Official visits rarely brought good news. Her second thought was embarrassment at being singled out in front of customers who already questioned her background and character. Colonel Morrison approached her station with the measured stride of someone accustomed to command. "Staff Sergeant Washington?" "Yes, sir," Sarah replied automatically, her voice carrying the crisp tone of military response despite her civilian clothes. "I'm Colonel Morrison. I wonder if we could speak privately for a moment." Sarah glanced around the busy diner, acutely aware of the attention they were drawing. "I'm in the middle of my shift, sir. Would it be possible to speak after work?" "I'm afraid this can't wait. It's regarding your Bronze Star citation." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. Her Bronze Star citation was one of the few things from her military career that she still treasured, a recognition of her actions during the convoy attack that had ended her service. The idea that there might be some problem with it filled her with dread. "Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" the colonel asked, his tone gentler now. Mel appeared at Sarah's elbow as if summoned. "You can use my office," he said to the colonel, then turned to Sarah. "Take all the time you need." As they made their way to Mel's cramped back office, Sarah was hyper-aware of the whispered conversations starting at tables throughout the diner. The women who had been making snide comments about failed soldiers and charity cases were staring with open curiosity. Once in the office with the door closed, Colonel Morrison's formal demeanor softened slightly. "Relax, Staff Sergeant. You're not in trouble. In fact, quite the opposite." Sarah remained standing at attention, old habits taking over in the presence of a senior officer. "The Department of Defense has been conducting a review of Bronze Star citations from Operation Enduring Freedom. Your case came to our attention because of witness statements that were never properly considered during the original investigation." Sarah felt her confusion growing. "Sir, I don't understand. Your actions during the convoy attack on March 15th. We've learned that the official report significantly understated what you did that day." New testimony from Corporal Williams, who was medically evacuated before he could provide a statement, paints a very different picture of events. The colonel opened a folder he had been carrying and extracted several documents. "According to Corporal Williams, you didn't just get 2 wounded Marines to safety. You made 4 separate trips into the kill zone to extract wounded personnel, all while under continued enemy fire. You also identified and neutralized an enemy sniper position that was preventing medical evacuation." Sarah's mind reeled. She remembered the chaos of that day in fragments, the explosion, the screaming, the urgent need to get her Marines to safety. The adrenaline and Shock had made everything seem surreal, dreamlike. "Sir, I just did my job." "You did much more than your job, Staff Sergeant. Which is why the Department of Defense is upgrading your Bronze Star with V device to the Silver Star." The words didn't compute at first. Sarah stood frozen, trying to process what she had just heard. The Silver Star? For gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States. The ceremony is scheduled for next month at Camp Pendleton, but I wanted to deliver the news personally and invite you to participate in the formal presentation. Sarah felt tears threatening and struggled to maintain her composure. The Silver Star was the third highest military decoration for valor, a recognition she had never dreamed she would receive. "I'm honored, sir. But I have to ask, why now? It's been 3 years. Sometimes the truth takes time to surface, Staff Sergeant. The important thing is that it did surface, and that your actions are finally receiving the recognition they deserve." Through the thin walls of Mel's office, Sarah could hear the normal sounds of the diner continuing. Orders being called out, coffee cups clinking, conversations buzzing. It seemed impossible that her life was being transformed while Eggs Benedict was being served 20 feet away. "There's one other thing," Colonel Morrison continued. "The ceremony will be covered by military media, and likely some civilian outlets as well. Your story, a decorated Marine working as a waitress while dealing with combat injuries. It's the kind of story that resonates with people." Sarah's stomach clenched at the thought of media attention. "Sir, I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that level of exposure. I understand your concerns. But consider this. How many young Marines could benefit from seeing that there's life after military service, even when that service ends unexpectedly? How many veterans struggling with their own transitions might find hope in your example?" Before Sarah could respond, there was a knock on the office door. Mel's voice called through the wood. "Sarah? Sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation out here that needs your attention." Colonel Morrison opened the door to find Mel looking flustered and slightly angry. "What kind of situation?" Sarah asked. "Those society ladies heard enough of your conversation to figure out you're being honored for military service. They're making loud comments about it being some kind of publicity stunt. It's disrupting other customers." Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of public attention she had spent months avoiding. "Would you like me to address this?" Colonel Morrison asked, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding respect. "No, sir. Thank you. But I need to handle this myself." Sarah straightened her shoulders and walked back into the dining room, feeling David's eyes on her as she approached the women's table. The rest of the diner had gone quiet, sensing the drama unfolding. "Ladies," Sarah said, her voice carrying a confidence that surprised even her. "I understand you have some concerns about my service record." The woman in the cream blazer looked up with a mixture of defiance and uncertainty. "We're simply questioning why someone claims to be a war hero when they're clearly working a minimum wage job." "You're right to question claims," Sarah replied evenly. "So let me be clear about mine. I'm Staff Sergeant Sarah Washington, United States Marine Corps, retired. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan as a combat engineer. The scar on my face is from an IED explosion that killed 2 of my Marines. I was awarded the Purple Heart for wounds received in action and the Bronze Star for actions under fire." She paused, letting the information settle before continuing. "And, as of today, that Bronze Star is being upgraded to the Silver Star, which is presented only for gallantry in action against an enemy of the United States." The silence in the diner was complete now. Sarah could see shock and embarrassment on the women's faces, but she wasn't finished. "You're also right that I'm working what you consider a minimum wage job. I'm doing that because transitioning from military to civilian life is challenging, especially when you're dealing with combat injuries and the end of a career you loved. There's no shame in honest work while you figure out what comes next." She looked around the diner, making eye contact with other customers who had been witness to months of subtle and not-so-subtle disrespect. What there is shame in is judging people based on their appearance or their circumstances without knowing their story. Each person serving your food, cleaning your tables, or checking you out at stores has a life and a history that you know nothing about. Some of them are heroes. All of them deserve basic human dignity. The woman in the cream blazer had the grace to look mortified. 2 months after the Silver Star ceremony at Camp Pendleton, Sarah Washington sat in her new office at Vanguard Engineering Solutions, reviewing technical specifications for a bridge reconstruction project in rural Afghanistan. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was once again working in Afghanistan, but this time as a civilian engineer helping to rebuild infrastructure she had once helped defend. The ceremony itself had been overwhelming in the best possible way. Standing in her dress blues as Colonel Morrison pinned the silver star to her chest, Sarah had felt the pride she thought she had lost forever. Her sister had flown in from Detroit, her parents had driven up from San Diego, and David had been there in his own dress blues, having received a commendation for his role in preventing the jewelry store robbery. The media attention that followed had been intense, but manageable, largely because David had helped her navigate the interview requests and public appearances. More importantly, it had led to job offers from 3 different engineering firms, all of whom were eager to hire a Silver Star recipient with her technical background and leadership experience. Vanguard had offered the best package, competitive salary, veteran-friendly policies, and the opportunity to work on infrastructure projects in conflict zones where her military experience would be an asset rather than a liability. The company's founder was a former Army officer who understood the value of hiring veterans with real-world experience in challenging environments. A knock on her office door interrupted her review of the project specifications. David appeared in the doorway, wearing a suit that made him look like a successful businessman rather than a former gunnery sergeant. "Got a minute?" he asked. "For my favorite security consultant?" "Always." David had taken the position with the private security firm and was now managing corporate protection contracts for several major companies. Their offices were in the same building, 3 floors apart, which had made their relationship progression feel natural and unforced. "How's the Afghanistan project coming along?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Complex, but manageable. The interesting part is that I know some of the terrain from my deployments. It's strange to be planning construction in places where I used to plan security patrols. Good strange or bad strange?" Sarah considered the question. 6 months ago, anything that reminded her of her military service had felt painful. Now, those memories felt like valuable experience that informed her civilian work. Good strange. It feels like my service actually means something again, like those deployments weren't just about getting through them safely. Speaking of which, I have some news that might interest you. The State Department is looking for engineering consultants to work on a major infrastructure project in Jordan. They specifically requested personnel with Middle East experience and security clearances. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Let me guess, your company would provide security for the engineers." "Something like that. Plus, it would mean we could work together officially instead of just having lunch meetings to coordinate schedules." Their relationship had developed slowly and carefully over the past few months, both of them cautious about mixing their professional rebuilding with personal connection. But it had felt right in a way that surprised Sarah with its naturalness. David understood her nightmares and hypervigilance, just as she understood his need for routine and his discomfort with unexpected changes. "I'll think about it," Sarah said. "Right now I'm focused on proving myself here before I start considering international assignments." "Fair enough. But keep it in mind. The opportunity might not come around again." Their conversation was interrupted by Sarah's phone buzzing with a text message. She glanced at it and smiled. "What's that about?" David asked. "Message from Mel. Apparently, he's been getting interview requests from food industry magazines about his hero Waitress. He wants to know if I'd be willing to do a piece about veteran employment. Are you?" Sarah considered it. The attention still made her uncomfortable, but she had come to understand Colonel Morrison's point about the value of sharing her story. Maybe, if it helps other veterans realize that setbacks don't have to be permanent, it might be worth the discomfort. "You've come a long way from the woman who tried to hide her scar from customers. I've had good motivation to change my perspective." David's expression softened. "Speaking of perspective, there's something I've been meaning to ask you." "Sounds serious." "It is, kind of." David reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. "I know this is probably faster than either of us planned, but the thing about military life is that it teaches you to make decisions when you're sure about something." Sarah felt her breath catch as David opened the box to reveal a simple but elegant diamond ring. "Sarah Washington, you're the bravest person I know, the most competent engineer I've ever met, and the only woman who's ever made me want to plan a future beyond the next deployment. Will you marry me? The proposal was so perfectly David, straightforward, honest, and grounded in practical understanding of who they both were. Sarah looked at the ring, then at the man who had seen past her scars to the person she was still learning to value again. Yes, she said without hesitation. But I have one condition. Name it. If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Full military ceremony, dress blues, the whole thing. I want everyone who ever doubted that a scarred waitress could build a good life to see exactly how good that life can be. David grinned and slipped the ring onto her finger. I wouldn't have it any other way, Staff Sergeant. 6 months later, the wedding took place at the Marine Corps base in Quantico, with an honor guard and a reception that brought together everyone who had been part of Sarah's journey from injured veteran to successful engineer and proud military spouse. Mel was there, beaming with pride as he danced with Sarah during the father-daughter portion of the evening. Her parents had flown in from California, along with her sister and her growing family. Colonel Morrison attended in full dress uniform, as did several of her former squad members who had tracked her down after the media coverage of her Silver Star ceremony. But perhaps most meaningful to Sarah were the 3 women from the diner, who approached her during the reception with obvious discomfort and genuine remorse. Mrs. Torres, the woman who had worn the cream blazer, said formally, "We wanted to apologize for our behavior at the diner. We were inexcusably rude and judgmental." "You were," Sarah agreed gently. "But you also learned from it, and that matters more than the original mistake. We've started volunteering with a local veterans support organization," another of the women added. "It's been educational." "I'm glad to hear that. Veterans need community support, especially during the transition period." After they walked away, David appeared at Sarah's side. "That was gracious of you. They're trying to do better. That's all anyone can ask." As the evening wound down and the reception began to empty, Sarah found herself standing outside the reception hall with David, looking up at stars that seemed brighter than they had in years. "Any regrets?" David asked, following her gaze upward. "About which part? Leaving the Marines, working at the diner, or marrying you?" "Any of it. All of it." Sarah considered the question seriously. 3 years ago, she had thought her life was over when the IED explosion ended her military career. She had believed that her value as a person was tied to her ability to serve in uniform, and losing that had left her feeling worthless and lost. Now she understood that service came in many forms. She served her country by rebuilding infrastructure in dangerous places. She served her community by working on projects that improved people's lives. She served other veterans by sharing her story and proving that life after military service could be fulfilling and meaningful. "No regrets," she said finally. "Everything that happened led to this moment, to this life. Even the painful parts were necessary. Even the diner? Especially the diner. Working there taught me that dignity isn't about what job you have or how people treat you. It's about how you treat yourself and others, regardless of circumstances." David took her hand, his thumb brushing over her wedding ring and the small scar on her knuckle from a long-ago training exercise. "Ready to go home, Mrs. Torres?" Sarah looked back at the reception hall one more time, seeing through the windows the last few guests saying their goodbyes. Her journey from Staff Sergeant Washington to Waitress Sarah to engineer and wife had been longer and more complicated than she ever could have imagined. But it had led her to exactly where she needed to be. "Ready," she said, and meant it completely. As they walked toward their car, Sarah reflected on all the people who had been part of her story. The Marines who had served alongside her, the customers who had treated her with kindness or cruelty, Mel who had given her a chance when she needed one, and David who had seen her potential when she couldn't see it herself. But, perhaps most importantly, she thought about the version of herself who had been ashamed of her scar and afraid of the future. That woman had been brave too, in her own way, just by getting up each morning and facing a world that seemed designed to remind her of everything she had lost. Now Sarah understood that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or pretending that trauma hadn't happened. It was about integrating all the pieces of herself, the Marine, the survivor, the engineer, the wife, into someone whole and worthy of love and respect. The scar on her face would always be there, a permanent reminder of the night that changed everything. But it was no longer a mark of shame or limitation. It was proof of her strength, her service, and her ability to rebuild a life that was even better than the one she had originally planned. And that, Sarah thought as David held the car door open for her, was the kind of victory worth celebrating. We had no idea. No, you didn't. But you made assumptions anyway, and those assumptions shaped how you treated me. That's something worth thinking about. Sarah turned and walked back toward the kitchen, feeling lighter than she had in months. Behind her, she heard Colonel Morrison's voice addressing the now quiet diner. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Colonel Morrison, United States Marine Corps. What you just witnessed is exactly the kind of grace under pressure that earned Staff Sergeant Washington her decorations. The Marine Corps is proud to call her one of our own." As Sarah passed David's spot at the counter, he caught her hand briefly. "Outstanding," he said quietly, his voice filled with the kind of pride she hadn't heard directed at her in years. For the first time since her discharge, Sarah felt like Staff Sergeant Washington and Waitress Sarah had finally become the same person, someone who could serve with honor whether she was wearing dress blues or a diner uniform. "Same here. But if it's important, you should handle it. Can we do this again? Soon." Sarah found herself nodding before she had consciously made the decision. "I'd like that." David stood, then paused. "Sarah, those decorations you earned, you should be proud of them. Don't let anyone make you feel like your service was anything less than honorable." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the coffee shop for another hour, processing everything that had happened. For the first time since her discharge, someone had looked past her injury to see the Marine she had been. Someone had acknowledged her service record and treated her like the professional she had trained to be. As she drove home, Sarah found herself thinking about David's question regarding her engineering career. Maybe it was time to stop hiding behind the diner's predictable routine. Maybe it was time to remember that Staff Sergeant Sarah Washington had never backed down from a challenge, and civilian Sarah Washington didn't have to either. She had no way of knowing that David's urgent phone call was about a security situation involving a local business, or that his quick thinking and decisive action that night would soon bring him to the attention of people who could change both their lives in ways neither of them could imagine. "That Marine who's been coming in? I figured there was something familiar about him. Takes one to know one, I suppose." Sarah looked at Mel with surprise. In 6 months of working for him, he had never mentioned military experience. "Army, 82nd Airborne, Vietnam," he said with a slight smile. "Long time ago, but you don't forget how to recognize family." The word family resonated more deeply than Sarah had expected. She had been feeling adrift for so long, disconnected from the sense of belonging that had defined her military years. The idea that she might still be part of something larger than herself was both comforting and terrifying. As she walked to her car, Sarah reflected on how much her life had changed in just a few days. She had a coffee date, or whatever it was, with someone who might actually understand her. For the first time in months, she felt like she was moving forward rather than just surviving. The evening air was crisp as she drove home to her small apartment, and Sarah found herself looking forward to tomorrow in a way she hadn't experienced since her discharge. Maybe there was life after the Marines after all. Maybe David Torres, gunnery sergeant, retired, was going to help her figure out what that life might look like. She had no idea that their coffee meeting would be the catalyst for changes that would transform not just her own life, but the lives of everyone who thought they knew Sarah Washington, the quiet waitress with the scarred face who served coffee with military precision and kept her past carefully hidden. Sarah wrote down the order, noting his choice. The Veterans Special wasn't advertised on the menu. It was something Mel had created for the handful of former military customers who frequented the diner. Word had gotten around through some unofficial network that Mel was veteran-friendly, and Sarah had served more than a few customers who carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of former service members. "How do you know about that?" she asked, genuine curiosity overriding her usual professional reserve. David smiled, and for the first time since she had started working at the diner, Sarah felt like someone was really seeing her. Lucky guess. As she walked to the kitchen to place his order, Sarah found herself wondering what David's story was. In 6 months of working at the diner, she had become expert at reading customers within seconds of meeting them. But David was different. familiar in a way that made her both comfortable and nervous. The rest of her shift passed quickly, with David eating his breakfast in comfortable silence while reading something on his phone. He left a generous tip and a quiet thank you that seemed to carry more weight than the usual pleasantries exchanged between server and customer. It wasn't until later, as Sarah was wiping down tables at the end of her shift, that she realized what had been different about him. For the first time in months, she had forgotten to keep her scar turned away from a customer. And, for the first time in even longer, it hadn't mattered.